Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέξη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2020. Σήμερα θα διαβάσουμε το πρώτο κεφάλαιο από το μυθιστόρημα Desert of the Heart της Jane Rule. Είναι ένα εξαιρετικό μυθιστόρημα κατά την δική μου ταπεινή άποψη και η ταινία είναι πολύ καλή και για τα δεδομένα της εποχής όταν γυρίστηκε ήταν πρωτοποριακή και στο κίνημα φυσικά έχει πλέον χαρακτήρα cult. Θα συστήνω και τα δύο ανεπιφύλακτα. Πρώτο κεφάλαιο λοιπόν. Conventions, like clichés, have a way of surviving their own usefulness. They are then excused or defended as the idioms of living. For everyone, foreign by birth or by nature, convention is a mark of fluency. That is why, for any woman, marriage is the idiom of life. And she does not give it up out of scorn or indifference, but only when she is forced to admit that she has never been able to pronounce it properly and has committed continually its grossest grammatical errors. For such a woman, marriage remains a foreign tongue, an alien landscape, and since she cannot become naturalized, she finally chooses voluntary exile. Evelyn Hall had been married for 16 years before she admitted to herself that she was such a woman. But now, on a plane that was taking her from Oakland, California to Reno, Nevada, she felt curiously unchanged. The anger, guilt, grief, and resignation that she experienced now were the same emotions that had always competed in her, and the same small public securities she had felt as a young wife were with her now. It was true that the Mrs., which had been an epithet, would soon be no more than a courtesy, and the ring she had never taken for granted would not, of course, be granted any more. It was odd that she could not take it off. She had tried before she left the house, first casually at the kitchen sink, then frankly in the bathroom, but soap and water would not ease the ring over a joint thickened those 16 years into obstacle. It would, she supposed, have to be cut off. It was possible to have the Mrs. cut off too, but just as she was not to be married, she was not to be single ever yet again either. She was to be divorced, a convention that might be as strange to her as the convention of marriage had been. From the plane window, Evelyn looked out at the new landscape, the mountains shelving down under her to the edge of the desert, to the town through which a river flowed and disappeared into miles of burning sand. If it looked familiar, it was not because she had ever been there before. She had seen the travel posters and the advertisements. She had reluctantly read westerns. And in dreams she had experienced what was now the actual descent, a lurching uncertainty toward Earth. In the airport waiting room, the calendar read July 27th, and the hands of the wall clock hedged their specific way to 4. Though the Chamber of Commerce had left its few stamped souvenirs, the syndicated's double row of slot machines, time seemed more local than place. The passengers waited in a slow humiliation of heat. The flies were terrible. They crawled across the floor and counter. They settled with indifferent intimacy in the hair, on the face, refusing to be brushed away. But dirty and airless as the waiting room was, it provided shelter from the direct desert sun. Evelyn was reluctant to step out onto the pavement to claim her luggage. There, the sudden brutality of heat made her sweat with a threatening nausea. She did not wait for the limousine. She signaled a taxi, the first of so many small, necessary luxuries. The address of the guest house was in the lawyer's letter. He had suggested that it would be pleasanter and cheaper than a hotel. As Evelyn watched the cab meter, she wished she had asked Mrs. Packard just how much she charged for room and board. It had seemed, at the time Evelyn was writing, indelicate to inquire. Perhaps, after all, she was changing. She was full of new proprieties. She had bought 2 hats and made some effort to give up smoking. And she had caught herself twice in the last few days referring to George as Mr. Hall. Guilt, not only at its source, but in its expression, is reactionary. For years she had kept it in her house, as dull, vague, and persistent as the company of a cat. But now, more sharply focused, it struggled to become righteous indignation. The billboards advertising restaurants, outrageously expensive motels, and gambling casinos only mildly offended her, but she was truly angered by the jewelers' exaggeration of their wares along that wide desert highway. Wedding rings were as big as hula hoops or moon gates to play with, to walk through, to roll down a hill. And the all-night jeweler claimed to be just doors away from the famous neon chapel, which offered in great block letters 24-hour service, including a minister, flowers, a photographer, and witnesses. Perhaps they also supplied spare brides and grooms. As the billboards dwindled to the edge of town, they were replaced by the actual buildings, more substantial and garish than their copies. Evelyn was almost grateful for the occasional familiarity of a supermarket or used car lot. The cab turned off the main street into an ill-defined neighborhood of smaller public buildings, newly shadowing the few private houses where homemade signs offered music lessons, alterations, and tea. There was a deserted school, a tall building with small windows, surrounded by a blank, baked earth yard. Over the roofs of the next residential block there was the inverted exclamation mark of a church spire. It was Sunday. As the cab pulled up to the curb, Evelyn looked out at a large grey house set back from the street, silly with window boxes. She would not let her body falter as her mind did. She got out of the cab, paid the driver, picked up her suitcases, and walked quickly toward the house. Frances Packer opened the front door. She was a small, round woman in her 50s, mother-faced, proprietary. She greeted Evelyn by name and then called to her son, Walter. He came into the hall from the living room, a tall, square, bland-faced boy, blinking into the sunlight, the Sunday funnies still in his hand. He reminded Evelyn of so many anonymous youngsters who lounged somehow comfortably in the restrictive chairs at the back of her lecture room day after day, year after year, repeating and spreading themselves like perennials. "Will you take Mrs. Hall up to her room, dear?" Then she turned to Evelyn pleasantly. "Dinner's at 5. "That's fine. I'll just have time to wash." The upstairs hall smelled faintly of incense, but it was cool. The room Walter showed Evelyn into was large and leaf-dappled. The double bed had been modernized, the headboard removed, the footboard now serving in its place so that the bed settled quietly and, less importantly, into the floor space, no longer a stage for production, now a simple place of rest. It was the antique secretary in the corner that dominated the room. A social psychologist could not have designed a living space more appropriate. "The bathroom's right next door. There ought to be clean towels just inside the closet there," Walter said, as he put one suitcase on the luggage rack at the foot of the bed, the other across the arms of a chintz chair. "Don't smoke in bed. There isn't any fire escape. Put toenails in the ashtray. And don't keep pets. Mealtimes and other house rules are in the printed folder in the Gideon Bible by your bed. Any questions?" Evelyn grinned at him, grateful for his nonsense, but unable to think of a suitable reply. Outside the classroom she had always been slow-witted with adolescents. "Well, I have one," he continued. "We've been having an argument. I told Mother that she could call you Dr. Hall. Isn't that your proper title?" "It doesn't really matter at all," Evelyn replied. She was one of the few women she knew who preferred Mrs. to Doctor, perhaps because her marriage had been more difficult than her Ph.D. to achieve and maintain. Then, too, George had been sensitive about it. Walter was right, of course. Doctor now was her only proper title, but it seemed too easy a solution, or too ironic. "If you come down about 1:45, that gives you 15 minutes. There'll be sherry in the living room." "Lovely. Thanks." As Walter closed the door behind him, Evelyn took off her hat and opened one suitcase to find her cosmetic bag. In the large, clean, old-fashioned bathroom she discovered the source of the incense. Airwick or a pine deodorant would have depressed her, but incense was her great-aunt Ida, maiden and militant, who had lived alone in a house very like this. But she had mastered the master bedroom with nothing but her own royal virginity, which had deserved the stage, unaltered, on which she had been conceived. The bathroom, just like this, had fascinated Evelyn when she was a child, but she was never allowed to use the incense. Like snuff, like wine, like perfume, it was for adults only. So now Evelyn had no intention of offending the air with more than the scent of her own soap. She could not resist the temptation to light a small stick of it and set it in the stand. candle of corporeal service in memory of Ida, but the odour confined in the room caught in her throat. She had to put it out. "Ah, Ida," she said softly, "it's true what you used to say. We are a weaker generation." Evelyn looked at the tub, long, deep, claw-footed, and realized how much she wanted a bath, but there wasn't time now. After dinner she could be leisurely. As she went down the stairs, cooler, cleaner, if not quite refreshed, the voices in the living room sounded cheerful. It might, after all, be quite a pleasant place to stay. The thought that she might actually enjoy herself had not occurred to her before, and, irreverent as she considered it, she did not rebuke herself. "So there's a new arrival, is there?" It was a woman's voice, young and mock cheerful. "Delivered, as every one of them is to this house, full grown and female, out of our old father's racked brain. And she looks like me." There were only two of them, Walter struggling up out of the deep armchair, and the girl whose voice Evelyn had heard. She stood in a cage of sunlight by the way window. Evelyn smiled, consciously amused and invulnerable, because the girl was as young as a student. But as she turned, embarrassed and apologetic, to Evelyn, Evelyn was startled. "Dr. Hall, this is Anne Childs," Walter said. "How about some sherry? Would you like a cigarette?" "Thanks," Evelyn said. "Hello, Anne." "Hello." Anne stared at her. "There's a line from Cummings," Evelyn said. "Hello is what a mirror says." "We do look alike," Anne said. "Frances was right, don't we?" "Yes, very much. It startled me." "Do you think we're related?" Anne asked. "Maybe we are," Evelyn answered, but she did not think so. There was no family resemblance, a turned eye-tooth or a surprised left eyebrow that siblings share from a common grandparent. It was rather an impression which, when analyzed, seemed to have no firm basis. Anne's face was, for Evelyn, a memory, not a likeness, but probably not. "No," Anne said, her own certainty fading. "Walter says you teach at Cal." "That's right." "What department?" "English." Walter handed Evelyn a glass of sherry. When she sat down, he did also, choosing a chair that would keep him at the edge of conversation. But Anne continued to stand. Perhaps it was the strain of looking up at her. Perhaps it was the sherry. Evelyn felt a not altogether unpleasant lightheadedness. She found it difficult to follow and answer the questions Anne was asking her, and as she watched rather than listened, she thought how extraordinary the girl's clothes were. On that hot evening she wore black wool frontier pants, black boots, and a brilliant blue-green long-sleeved shirt. Evelyn had not been in the real West before, but she assumed that such a costume was reserved for rodeos. "Do you think so?" Anne asked at the end of a question that had something to do with symbolism and yeats. "I'm sorry I was admiring your shirt." Anne looked down at herself. "It's a uniform. I work at Frank's Club, the night shift." "At the Frank's Club. That's right. What do you do?" "I'm a change apron." When Evelyn looked bewildered, Anne explained, "I make change for the slot machine customers." "You do?" Evelyn could not help showing her surprise and amusement. "How did you get the job?" "I've been there for 4 years," Anne answered. "I live here." "She could be a dealer," Walter said, "but she doesn't want to. The idiot. That's where all the real money is for the women." Evelyn saw her own unconscious assumptions flower and fade in Anne's eyes like the blooms of transplanted bulbs. If Anne was not here for a divorce, if she lived in Reno, why was she in this house? Was she related to the Packers? "Here's Virginia," Walter said, rising from his chair. "Dr. Hall, this is Mrs. Ritchie." Virginia Ritchie was a thin, pretty young woman. She waited at the edge of the room, even after the introduction, looking nervously from Evelyn to Anne and back again. It was obvious that she, too, saw a striking resemblance between them, but she could not comment on it. She clutched a hat and gloves as if they steadied her uncertain balance, and waited for someone to explain. "Have some sherry with us," Anne suggested. "Oh, thank you, but—" "Come on," Walter encouraged, almost brusque with awkwardness. "Frances says dinner's ready." "Come along," Frances called from the dining room. "If we don't eat right away, Anne will be late to work and Virginia late to church." "Going to Evensong?" Anne asked as they moved into the dining room. "I thought I would," Virginia answered. "Dr. Hall, perhaps you—" "Thank you," Evelyn answered quickly. "I think not tonight. I haven't had a chance to unpack." No, of course. Mrs. Hall, will you sit here? Francis Packer indicated the place at Walter's right. Anne sat to his left, Virginia Ritchie beside her. You go right ahead and carve, dear. I'll just get the vegetables and gravy. Walter did not carve well. He was awkward and unconsciously brutal. Walter, dear, it's already dead, Anne said wryly as she watched him struggle. Relax. Walter sighed, stared for a moment at the leg of lamb, and then continued. In his real irritation, he apparently did not trust himself to answer. Evelyn smiled. She did like him, and she liked Anne with him. They were like brother and sister in a sentimental play, rude and obviously fond. How long will you be staying, Dr. Hall? Virginia Ritchie asked suddenly. Why, Evelyn hesitated. 6 weeks, I suppose. Oh. Virginia worked at her napkin furiously with both hands. In the silence, Evelyn could hear Francis, a spoon, dragging the gravy pan for foreign bodies. I'm so sorry. For what? Walter demanded with bursting irritation, but Virginia had begun to cry. As Francis came in with the gravy, Virginia got up from the table and left the room to sob, step by step, up the stairs to her bedroom. Francis looked at Walter. It wasn't a deep cut, he said defensively. She's hardly bleeding at all. Walter, you're old enough to be kind, Francis said. Fix me a plate. I'll take Virginia's dinner up to her. She turned to Evelyn. She isn't usually like this. Sundays upset her. When Francis left the room, Walter began to serve. Did I upset her? Evelyn asked. Surely she was not wrong about Virginia Ritchie, too. Everything upsets her, Walter answered warily. If I forget to pee down the side of the pot, she cries herself to sleep. And Walter's obviously sensitive about being a boy, so you can see how tense and psychological the whole situation is, Anne said. 2 helpings of string beans for you, girl child, and no dessert. Careful, Anne warned. You have a date tonight. Blackmailing capitalist. One of these days I will need your car. If I weren't a poor, struggling young man working my way through college, you're breaking my heart, Anne cried. I hoped I was. Their teasing was routine enough to be mindless, and they used it now with a tired, nervous energy to cover the awkwardness of Virginia's departure. Evelyn watched and smiled and wished she could think of something to say. She felt both curiously exposed and unknown. I hope you're not waiting for me, Francis said as she hurried back into the room. Have you had the gravy, Mrs. Hall? Thank you. The phone rang. I'll get it, Walter said as Francis started up from her chair. Sit down and eat your dinner. I feel we shouldn't try to eat on Sundays at all, Francis said. Walter says I'm a compulsive eater, but when I suggest, it's a long distance for Virginia. Shall I call her? Walter looked into the room from the hall. Well, yes, do. I suppose so. But don't yell. Go up. I must have that phone moved out of the hall. I wish I could think where. How about the bathroom? Anne suggested. I actually considered it, but it's something about the wires being near water and all. Can I get you more meat, Mrs. Hall? Anne? No, you won't. If everyone ate as little as Anne, we could go right ahead and feed China. That's my theory, Anne answered. Anne has a real Robin Hood complex, Francis said brightly. It's much less complicated and much more subversive than communism. Corrupt the rich to feed the poor. Isn't that it, Anne? Francis doesn't like gambling, Anne said. Neither do you, Francis asserted. This argument, like Anne's and Walter's teasing, was a familiar exercise without important malice, but Evelyn was made uncomfortable by it. There was a real tension between Anne and Francis. Walter came back to the table and confronted the cold remains of his dinner gloomily. Out in the hall, Virginia's tear-stained voice was resonant and clear. Mommy loves you, darling. It's only 3 more weeks now. You be a good boy. Mommy loves you very much. For God's sake, Mother, talk about something, will you? Frances did. She discussed fundraising for the Episcopal Church, legal adoption, the Reno flood. The connection between one subject and another was superficial but skillful. If Frances was extravagant in her subject matter, she was not undisciplined. Anne offered an occasional question or comment while Walter ate his cold potatoes. Evelyn sat silent, trapped between the competing voices, irritated and oddly ashamed. When Virginia finally said goodbye and rushed back upstairs, Frances also stopped talking and got up to clear the dishes to a tea cart which she had then wheeled to the kitchen. Thank you, Walter said. He felt in his shirt pocket with his left hand and took out a pack of cigarettes. Smoke? No, thanks. Evelyn's head ached. Her throat was sour with the food she had eaten. She longed to have the meal over. What time is it? Anne asked. 6. You've got an easy 20 minutes. Relax. Will you leave the car in the lot? Oh, I'll probably come and pick you up. Walter rose to take the last of the serving dishes away. What time do you get off? Evelyn asked, forcing a question against the candid look of sympathy Anne gave her as soon as they were alone in the room. 3 or 3:30. I'll be off at 3 tonight. Sunday's fairly slow. You must have to sleep all day. Oh, no. I'm always up by 11. These hot days I get up earlier. There's no point in a night job if you sleep the day away. I suppose not, Evelyn said. She could not think of anything more to say that was not personal, and because she herself disliked direct questions, she would not ask any. I suppose not. It really isn't usually as bad as this, Anne said. I'm sorry about all that nonsense I was talking. Please, Evelyn began, but was troubled by the urgency in her own voice. What was the matter with her? Do you drive? Anne asked quickly. Because I really don't use the car much during the day. Walt takes it to work. Any day you wanted to, you could drop him off and just have the car. That's very generous of you, but I don't refuse. You'll need things to do. I have plenty of work to do, Evelyn answered, her voice quite under control, her eyes consciously and silently reminding Anne of the 15 years that separated them. I'm sorry again, Anne said, her smile relieved and self-mocking. It's just playground tactics. If you won't be mad at me, I'll let you play with my car. I shouldn't suppose anyone stays mad at you for very long, Evelyn said, her voice still adult, but fond, as if to a child. Frances came in with a berry pie. Walter followed with the coffee. Now you have plenty of time, Anne, Frances said. You're to eat a piece of pie. I didn't say I wouldn't. She never wants dessert, Frances said to Evelyn. She never did, not even when she was a little girl. Walter imitated an expression of maternal concern. Anne looked down, demure. Frances, unnoticing, cut the pie with haphazard generosity, and they ate. After Walter and Anne had hurried off, Frances suggested a more peaceful cup of coffee in the living room. Evelyn raised the question of payment almost at once. I charge $65 a week. Fine, Evelyn said, a little too quickly. She had not really put her mind to any fixed amount, but her only experience with room and board had been the price set for students in Berkeley. She was therefore startled. Shall I pay you in advance? A week at a time. If you make other plans, just give me a week's notice. I'm sure I'll be quite comfortable here, Evelyn said. I'm glad. But sometimes, people change their minds. Do they? Evelyn asked. Well, yes, I suppose they might. Yes. The silence invited Evelyn to say something about herself, her own situation and intention. Let me get my checkbook, she said abruptly. That's not necessary. Tomorrow's plenty of time. I mustn't keep you then, Mrs. Pagger. Evelyn got up. Do call me Frances. Of course you want to unpack. You will run along. If there's anything you need, just let me know. I usually make tea around 10 o'clock. You come down if you'd like to, or before. I always like company, so don't ever feel you have to be alone. Have to be alone, Evelyn thought as she closed the bedroom door behind her. If she had known how much she would have to pay, it worked out to almost $400 for 6 weeks, she could have stayed in a hotel. 3 meals a day of the sort she had just survived would drive her mad. The hysteria, the awkwardness, the prying, the solicitude were unbearable. As she looked at her not yet unpacked suitcases, she thought for a moment that she need not stay, that she could simply close them, call a cab, and be gone. At the fact of escape, her imagination balked. I can't run away from running away. Nothing was wrong, really. It was only Virginia Ritchie, a caricature of the wronged woman, who made the others behave as they did. She would be gone in 3 weeks' time, perhaps sooner. Evelyn wondered why it had never occurred to her that, once in Reno, a woman might change her mind. Regret, yes, even terror, but like the suicide following, no way out. But that was ridiculous. Evelyn herself had waited until there was no choice, but perhaps other people acted on impulse. Virginia Ritchie was, after all, not much older than Anne Childs. All right, I admit it, Evelyn said quietly in answer to a thought she was not allowing herself to have. Anne was almost young enough to be her own child, but only a parent could be allowed to feel tenderness for his own likeness. In a childless woman, such tenderness was at best narcissistic, and Evelyn had learned that even less flattering names applied to the love a childless woman might feel for anything. Her dogs, her books, her students, yes, even her husband. She was not afraid of the names themselves, but she was afraid of the truth that might be in them. This resemblance was, she knew, not a trick need had played on her, neither was it a miracle. Aunt Childs was an accident, that was all. An accident, an illegitimate child, sprung full grown and female out of our all-father's racked brain. Evelyn smiled. And I shall feel tender toward her if I like. As she crossed the room to open the drawers of the highboy, she noticed that instead of the Gideon Bible Walter had promised, there was a small bowl of fresh fruit on the bedside table. Frances Packer was quite a nice woman, really. She hadn't been trying to pry. She had only offered the opportunity for Evelyn to ask for sympathy. And if many of her guests had been like Virginia Ritchie, Frances' friendliness was a calculated and saintly risk. I must tell her to call me Evelyn, she decided, and she folded nightgowns into the second drawer, trying to ignore the distaste she felt for such familiarity. When Evelyn had settled her belongings, it was only 7:30. She was not used to so early a dinner. All evenings would be long. It was just as well. She had planned to do a lot of work during these 6 weeks. Already she missed her books. She had only had room for 3 or 4 in her luggage. If she had taken the car, she would have everything she needed with her. George would not use it, but she had refused to suggest anything that would threaten or anger him further. There were libraries. Perhaps she would go tomorrow after she had seen the lawyer, or on Tuesday. That would give her something definite to do on Tuesday. Sitting down at the secretary, Evelyn made a list of the notes she should write. Evelyn's correspondence, since her sister's death 2 years ago, had dwindled to nothing very much more than Christmas letters to half a dozen old friends. Of these, Carol was the only person she wanted to write to, but she must send some words to the others as well. It would hardly do to save the news of her divorce to include in Christmas greetings. Emily Post, or whoever did that sort of thing now, should produce a form letter, or at least offer civilized suggestions for the announcement of a divorce. Mr. and Mrs. George Hall take pleasure in, or Mrs. Evelyn Hall? That was the right form now, wasn't it? But not takes pleasure. Did she regret it? Regrets the divorce of her only husband George? Is ashamed? Unhappily admits? For the contested divorce, the contesting partner could use refuses to admit. Evelyn put her hand up to her eyes, refusing to admit quite sudden tears. She wanted a cigarette. She had none. Lovely. She would have to go out to buy some. It was only 8 o'clock, still early enough to explore the immediate neighborhood. Out on the street, because it was a pleasant evening, and because the streets she had driven through were unpleasant, Evelyn turned east to walk farther into what must be a residential area. At first she was able to walk slowly, naming trees and flowers, feeling against her face and arms the fine drifts of spray from lawn sprinklers, a wavering pulse of sound everywhere, like evening crickets. She found the store before she wanted to, but afraid on a Sunday evening that it might not stay open long, she went in. Waited on at once by a silent, tired woman, Evelyn bought several packs of cigarettes and a bottle of sherry. As she came out onto the street again, she was reluctant to turn back. Beyond the next intersection, the street she had been walking narrowed and steepened to block her view. Curious, she went on. At the top of a short hill, Evelyn stopped, oddly out of breath. The street fingered out from the main crossroad for just 3 short blocks of faded brick bungalows and no trees. At the end was a desert, sudden, flat, dull miles of it until it heaved itself upward and became the mountains. An irrational fear, as alien to Evelyn's nature as heat lightning seems to a summer sky, struck through her body. For a moment she could not move. Then she turned quietly, refusing in herself the desire to run, and walked back to the house. Frances Packer was in the hall, but Evelyn refused the cup of tea she offered. "Would you like to take the paper up with you?" Frances suggested. "We've all finished with it." "Thank you, but do," Frances encouraged. It was little enough to accept. So Evelyn carried the unwanted paper up the stairs to her room. She glanced at the travel clock by her bed, picked it up, and listened to it. She had not forgotten to wind it. It clicked at her ear with precise regularity. How could she have been gone only 20 minutes? She put the clock down impatiently and began to undress. Good